And thank you, Terrell. Beautifully done. Beautiful song. This is around the Christian world that follow the Christian worship, a liturgical calendar, the day we associate with Transfiguration Sunday. Texts like these from Luke's Gospel will be read in Christian churches across the world, remembering this event, one of the major events in the narrative of Jesus found in the Gospels, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not found in John's Gospel, interestingly enough. But here in this Gospel, this story describes a transfiguration, a change of appearance that Jesus underwent during a time on a mountain with the core of his 12 disciples, Peter and John and James. And we're going to talk about that this morning. Again, I remind you that verse that Neil just read just a moment ago. And now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on a mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. I want to talk to you today about metamorphosis. The first time I encountered the word metamorphosis was in Benny Northam's 6th grade science class. Mr. Northam at Sulligent Elementary School, it was an elementary school because we didn't have a middle school designation at that time, but he was a science teacher, but he was also a farmer and a beekeeper. Matter of fact, one of the things I remember about his 6th grade classroom is that he had a miniature version of a beehive where you could actually see in and see the bees working away in a hive, and it was in the classroom. Some of you are worried about that, right? He had a tube connecting the hive through a hole that he had carved in the window to where the bees could enter and depart the hive without being in the classroom itself. So we would go and we'd look each day. We'd go by and look and check on those bees. It was also the first class where we dissected frogs, and I remember that. He also did something to help us understand the concept of metamorphosis. He brought in some caterpillars and put them he put them in another container that he had closed off, and we watched over days to see those caterpillars suddenly cease to be caterpillars and become butterflies, which we released. Metamorphosis. What does that word mean? It's really a Greek word that's found, the foundation of that word, metamorpho, is found in this text. And it's translated, his face was changed. His face was transformed. It was transfigured. A metamorphosis took place before the eyes of Peter and John and James. And notice it puts them in that order. When Peter, James, and John are first introduced, James, the older brother, is mentioned first, but then you pick up at a certain point, matter of fact, I think chapter 8, where Luke starts saying Peter and John and James. And throughout the Luke Acts narrative, Peter and John become even more important apparently than James, but that's for another day. Here's the story that we want to look at this morning, and I want to talk to you about metamorphosis, the ongoing need for us to be transformed into a greater likeness of Jesus in our lives as his followers. This message, this event in the life of the narrative of Jesus was intended to do, as Neil mentioned, to give a foretaste of the glory that was to come related to Christ. And so this is kind of an event that, it's left open to interpretation, because we're going to be told in the story that Peter and James and John were very sleepy. They were very drowsy. That happened with them, all right? Later on in the Garden of Gethsemane, we find out they couldn't stay awake there either. But here they're drowsy and they're sleepy, and so this happens in the context of a very tired group of disciples. But for them, even though we're told they never mentioned it until after the resurrection stories about Jesus, they started talking about this event becomes so important that 3 of the 4 Gospels mentions it and makes it a pivotal moment in the life and ministry of Jesus. So let's take a few moments to reflect on this story, and then I'm going to kind of draw it back around to the 21st century where we live today and ask myself and ourselves, what does it mean to be a part of an ongoing transformation where we listen to Jesus most of all? Well, let's talk about the story, the narrative. It says in Luke's version, about 8 days after Jesus had this private discussion with his disciples about not only his identity, but his impending death, as well as the glory that he had and shared with his Father when the kingdom would come. He says he took Peter and John and James and he went up on a mountain to pray. If you read the narrative, you'll notice from time to time, Jesus would kind of separate from the crowds and go off into a lonely or a quiet place. Mountains were some of his favorites. In the ancient world, people believed the mountains brought them, if not spiritually, if not physically, at least spiritually closer to God. And by getting away on the top of a high mountain, he was also escaping, I guess, from the crowds who wouldn't want to climb up so far. But he brought along his inner core, Peter and John and James, who were the first disciples he had called, and they became his closest associates. They shared experiences with Jesus that the rest of the 12 didn't share. There's an earlier story where Jesus goes into to bring back to life a young girl who had taken sick and died, and he brings Peter and James and John, or Peter, John, and James, it says there as well, in with him to have that experience. So they were a part of the inner circle. They had experiences that the rest of the 12 did not, and would not relate this to others until sometime in the future. But here they go up onto this mountain. Jesus goes there to pray. The disciples there to presumably to pray as well, but for the most part, they probably did what a lot of us would do if we were asked to pray on a high mountain after climbing it all day. They probably begin to become drowsy and doze off. That's what sets this up. For it, we're told that Jesus was transformed. It says in Luke's version, the appearance of his face changed. We don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, other than somehow he looked different than what they had normally associated with the way he was looking. And it says that his clothes became dazzling white. This is the ancient world saying that the glory that he shared with his Father was somehow being manifest through his person. And so they are snapped awake, or something's happening there. And Peter, John, and James see this happening. And while he is in this glorious state of transfiguration, of metamorphosis, two other characters appear and begin to converse with Jesus. They're well-known characters if you're familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. Moses, the lawgiver, the great deliverer, and Elijah, the prophet, both of whom have a little history with mountains themselves. Both Moses and Elijah, we're told in the Old Testament narratives, also had their own experiences on a mountain, Mount Horeb, where they went up and had conversations with Yahweh, the God of Israel. We're familiar with Moses because we often think of the two tablets, the Ten Commandments, are inscripted upon by the finger of God, it says in the text. Elijah goes in the mountain. He has this, in the midst of a crisis that he's experienced as being a prophet, because his arch enemies were King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, who are out to get him. But he's on this high mountain, and you remember the story. It says there's a wind and an earthquake, but the voice of Yahweh is not found in the wind or the earthquake. But how? In a still small voice, in a whisper. So again, these two characters have had a history with the mountain, and encounters and conversations, if you will, with the divine. And they also are prophets of old. We think of Moses as being a lawgiver, but he thought of himself as a prophet, because Moses had anticipated a day when another prophet like him would rise. Later on in the Acts narrative, the author of this same gospel says that quotes Moses as saying, you should listen to that prophet, meaning Jesus. Elijah, of course, is a well-known prophet of old because of his calling of the people under the leadership of Ahab and Jezebel back to the Torah. So both of these individuals are some of the most prominent characters in Hebrew scriptural history. And here they are, these stars, if you will, these heroes of the faith, having conversation with Jesus of Nazareth, Peter, John, and James, Master. Peter sees it, and like Peter does, he feels he needs to say something. And just as Moses and Elijah, who have been talking with Jesus about his departure. The word there in the Greek text is the word we could translate Exodus, about his departure and what he's going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Moses and Elijah, by the way, also had their own interesting departures from their life and ministry. Moses goes up on a mountain and doesn't come back down again. Reportedly, he dies there. A later tradition says his body was assumed, the assumption of Moses was carried into heaven. That's tradition, not found in the Bible. Elijah also had an interesting departure himself, right? Elijah says that Elisha, his protege, who's going to take up his mantle, literally, he sees the chariots of fire and the horses of fire from heaven, and Elijah disappears in a whirlwind up into the heavens, never to be seen again. So both of them had interesting departures themselves, and they're talking with Jesus about his departure and what he's going to accomplish in the future in Jerusalem. And as they're about to leave, that is Elijah and Moses, Peter doesn't want them to leave. He's impressed. And the implication here is he's equally impressed with Moses and Elijah as he is with the star of this show, which is the glorified Christ. So Peter, as Luke says, not knowing what he was saying. Have you ever been in that situation where you've been in a situation where you're a little dumbstruck by something, or maybe something has happened you can't quite get your mind wrapped around, and you don't exactly know what to say, so you say something? You ever been there? I've been there. I'm a preacher. I've done that. I kind of talk for a living, so there's a tendency when something happens, people want the preacher to say something, and sometimes you say the wrong something. This is one of those cases where Peter says, I need to say something. So, and I don't want Moses and Elijah to leave. After all, you'd want them to hang around too, wouldn't you? A lot of interesting conversations you could have. So Peter says, wait a minute. I'm paraphrasing. Wait a minute. It's good to be here. We're glad to be a part of this experience, guys. Why don't you stay a while? We'll actually build you, all three of you, one for Moses and one for Elijah and one for Jesus. We'll build you a tent or a shelter, a lean-to, if you will, so that you can kind of bed down for the rest of the night. It may have been at night anyway, and we can spend some time talking together. And then it says that a cloud from heaven surrounds them all, and the disciples become terrified because the cloud, of course, they're familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. When a cloud comes down on top of a mountain like it did at Sinai, that symbolizes the Shekinah, the glory of Yahweh, of God, manifest. And so they're enveloped in this cloud, and a voice from heaven, very similar to what happened in the baptismal story we read about earlier in the narrative. The voice from heaven says, in effect, and again, this is a paraphrase, Peter, shut up for a minute. This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him. Now don't miss that. Listen to him. Moses and Elijah are free to go. They make their departure. And we're told all that's left is Jesus standing there alone. But the key words in that whole frame, this is my son, the chosen one, listen to him. Now, understand what that doesn't say. Peter wants to make a tabernacle, a tent, a lean-to, very similar to the ancient Jewish practice, the Feast of Booths, where they would make little shelters. If you have a Jewish friend that's practicing more orthodox, perhaps, variety of the faith, then they're observing the booths. They may have set up in their backyard a little kind of lean-to, a tent, a tabernacle, reminding of them their temporary journeys to the wilderness and so forth. So Peter may be having a suggestion of that, but he wants to do one for one of each, basically putting them all on a level playing field. But the voice from heaven says, no. Someone more important than Moses is here. Someone more important than Elijah is here. They're free to depart, but you're stuck with Jesus. Listen to him. Listen to him. not Moses, not Elijah, who, by the way, seemed to represent the law and the prophets. When the ancient Hebrews of Jesus' time period talked about the Hebrew Scriptures, they called them the law and the prophets, the Torah and the prophets, the two major divisions of the Hebrew Scriptures. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. So what this story, the metaphorical and the continuing metaphorical significance of whatever happened on this mountain, is this. Jesus becomes the new way of looking at the Hebrew Scriptures. You interpret everything Moses did, everything Elijah did, or everything the law says, or everything the prophets declared, you interpret them through the lens, the interpretive principle, the hermeneutic of Jesus, who he was and what he said. As a matter of fact, they did that. Later on, it says in one of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, Jesus took his disciples through all the law and the prophets and the writings, and he told them, this is how you interpret it in light of who I am and what I've come to do. And I say this from time to time. It's important for us when we read the Bible, read it backwards through Jesus, not forwards from Moses and Elijah to Jesus. In other words, when we're looking at the Bible, we read it through the lens of who Jesus was and what he came to represent. And that's very important because there are things that Moses did that I don't think Jesus would ever have you do. There are things that Elijah did I don't think Jesus would have any part of. And if you look at Christian history, too often we've listened to other voices than the voice of Jesus. Now I want to preach a little bit here, okay? I'm going to put my paper down, all right? When I look at Christian history, one shocking thing that I find out is how quickly it departed from what Jesus said and what he wanted people to do. And you look at the broad scope of Christian history, and sometimes you see they did the exact opposite of what Jesus said and did. We still do that today because we listen to voices outside of Jesus when it comes to our faith and following him. Oh yeah, today, when I talk to fundamentalist Christians and many fundamentalist preachers, they're far more interested in Moses than they are in Jesus. When the preachers I were around have grown up, they seem more like Elijah than Jesus. You know, Elijah the prophet who cut off the heads of 400 other prophets of Baal. Remember that? And that great showdown we read about in the Kings. If you look at Christian history, you see that people are far more interested in looking at persons of power. Look at the rise of Constantine the Great and how he transformed Christianity. If you're familiar with your history, he was the Roman emperor who essentially co-opted Christianity for his own purposes and transformed Christianity from a top-down power structure that didn't resemble at all anything that really Jesus stood for or what he talked about. When I look at our own American history, I grew up in the state of Alabama, one of the most, throughout our history, one of the most evangelical, one of the most, I'll put it this way, one of the most southern evangelical dominated places in the world. Yet the way that people use the Bible to mistreat others, whether it be people who are of African descent, or even women, or any outsiders, gay people, etc. If you look at the way we have often behaved in the name of Christ, totally ignoring what Christ taught and how he exemplified his teachings in his life, you see a huge gap there, and it's an unacceptable gap. You know what we're guilty of? We're falling into that same stumbling block as Peter fell over. We're equating other voices, equivalent or better than or more important than Jesus' voice. We'd rather listen to the voice of our favorite preacher rather than listen to the voice of Jesus. We'd rather listen to the voice of our favorite politician than listen to the voice of Jesus, or our talk show radio host, or wherever we get our information from. We talk about it and we put Christian on the Christian label on it, but oftentimes it has nothing at all to do with what Jesus of Nazareth said, did, or taught. The gap between the religion that is called Christianity and the way it developed historically and who Jesus really was and what he really taught and what he really said and what he really did is enormous. And it is very, very important that we as 21st century followers of Jesus are very critical of those historic voices that have often been louder than the voice of Jesus in our ears. The message of Transfiguration Sunday is listen to Jesus. if you're one of his followers. It ought to be simple, right? But I can take you through time and time again where we didn't listen to Jesus at all. Can you imagine Jesus ordering a crusade or an inquisition? Can you? Where in the words of Jesus do you see a call to holy war or segregation or racial prejudice or bigotry of any sort? I hear the words, love your neighbor as yourself. Treat others the way you wish to be treated. I see Jesus in his example building bridges to others, not walls, looking for ways to bring people together rather than tear them apart. Yet there are so many voices out there, some of whom even claim the label of Christian, who are doing all those things that I can never imagine Jesus doing. Because they don't hear the words from heaven. This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him. We all need to be transformed. We all need to have a metamorphosis. And if it's being a metamorphosis as a follower of Jesus, then the first concern we should always have when a question is raised in our lives, in our communities, in the church, if we're followers of Jesus, I wonder how Jesus would approach this. I wonder what Jesus would say about it. We may not always know, because there are some contemporary issues that have arisen since the time of Jesus that we don't have a verse, a text, or a story to apply. And so we have to be careful. All we can do then is to operate in the spirit of Jesus, which was always the spirit of just mercy. It was always a spirit of compassion. It was always a spirit of seeing the other person as someone for whom God loves, rather than wishes to destroy and judge. I hope on this Transfiguration Sunday we might all experience more of a metamorphosis, more of a transformation into that kind of person, where the ringing question in our minds are, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? Listen to him. Are you listening?